Hello and welcome to Cluster 7's webinar, the 3 steps to managing spreadsheet risk in Sarbanes-Oxley. My name is Graham McRae. I'm the Product Marketing Manager for Cluster 7 and I'm based in London. I'm also joined by Jeremy Condy, who's the VP of Americas. He's based in New York. Moving on to the agenda, there are really 2 key areas we want to cover today. Firstly, what we're going to do is look at the issue of spreadsheet risk and the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. It may seem a slightly odd situation that we're talking about a 40-year-old technology and legislation that's been in place for 15 years. Nonetheless, it is an important issue for many companies in the US and actually in Europe too. Once I've taken you through that, I'll hand over to Jeremy and he'll actually take you through the 3-step approach that companies can use to actually enhance their spreadsheet risk management under the Act. There will be an opportunity to ask questions. If you can place them in the Q&A panel on the screen, we'll do our best to answer them at the end. But with that, we'll move on to the next slide. So currently, there is very much a Sarbanes-Oxley, a SOX Paradox. As I said earlier, we're dealing with 40-year-old technology and legislation that's been around since the beginning of the century. So really, the issue should not really be an issue for us, but clearly it is. So one of our partners, Productivity, do an annual survey around the workload and issues associated with Sarbanes-Oxley. And they found that something like the workload of the Sarbanes-Oxley and complying with Sarbanes-Oxley has increased by about 10% since 2016. And really, if you read the analysis, there are really 2 reasons for that. One reason is that spreadsheets are still ubiquitous amongst organizations that have to comply with the Act. The second point is that the PCAOB in the US is pushing auditors to scrutinize the issues associated with spreadsheet risk and other areas of the Act much more closely. There have been a few failures that have meant that the Act hasn't been followed as closely as it might have been. And so the auditors in the US are now being encouraged very strongly to look much more closely at the results they're being given, but also the business processes that underpin all of that. So let's move on to the next slide. So the standard environment for many organizations that comply with Sarbanes-Oxley is they're very structured, very distributed environment, very structured in terms of they may use Microsoft applications, they may use SAP applications, and there may well be some in-house applications as well. But particularly looking at things like SAP and Oracle applications, various other systems that are available, a lot of organizations use these applications to actually comply with the Act. They came out of the box, as it was said, kind of Sarbanes-Oxley ready, and they replaced a lot of the other applications that were used throughout systems, and they standardized on this. Part of that was to streamline the management of the business and to take cost out of the business, but a lot of it was to help with Sarbanes-Oxley compliance. So that's the ideal. However, the reality is much more complex. So moving on to the next slide. Many of these applications, in order to make them actually work effectively, require spreadsheets. Now, the challenge for many business practitioners is that if you ask for a change in one of these applications, it may well take 2 months before it actually gets implemented because the requirements have got to be documented, developed, designed, implemented, tested, and documented again. And they need to made sure that they don't interrupt any other processes or cause problems in the wider environment. And that can take quite some time. If you're a business owner, a line of business owner, or a manager, and your job is to get a report submitted by the end of the month, that becomes much harder if the change you want is going to take 2 months to actually implement. So people readily reach for the spreadsheet to actually get the report they need done by the end of the month while still working with the corporate IT function. And what that means is that in time, that spreadsheet becomes business as usual. It becomes part of the standard business process. And if you want to change that environment, you want to merge business units, if you want to take on an acquisition, those spreadsheets are absolutely crucial to the whole business process. And business practitioners, IT practitioners, ignore those risks associated with spreadsheets at their peril. So moving on to the next moving on to the next slide. Now this issue becomes even more complex when you start dealing with multiple business processes, so multiple iterations of the same application environment. But then you're moving on to the issue of final mile reporting. So moving on to the next slide, very often organizations use spreadsheets to actually bring disparate business lines and disparate business units and align them in terms of the overall direction of the business. Spreadsheets can actually be the glue that hold a lot of organizations together. Now that's great because they're flexible, they're dynamic. Spreadsheets are a wonderful invention, but from a Sarbanes-Oxley, as we'll see shortly, it does create quite a few problems that need to be managed. So moving on to the next slide. This issue becomes even more important if you then have multiple business units in the same group, or actually, as we're finding in Europe, where you've got a European subsidiary of an American listed organization that needs to report to its parent company under the auspices of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. So this final mile reporting, it's a great glue. Spreadsheets figure heavily, but from a Sarbanes-Oxley perspective, it creates real challenges. So moving on. So before I go any further, I do want to iterate that, as I said earlier, spreadsheets are hugely valuable to the business. As we touched on, spreadsheets are the tool that many people use to bridge the gap between what IT can deliver and what the business actually needs. IT, when they control their environment very closely, they're doing it for the right reasons, a lot of which are actually associated with the Act. But at the same time, business units need to be able to execute their plans, their strategies, and report on their strategies. And spreadsheets are a very good way of aligning the two. Their power and flexibility adds genuine dynamism to the business, but one needs to be very mindful of them when using them in a Sarbanes-Oxley environment. So, moving on to the next slide. So there are a range of challenges that need to be borne in mind when thinking about how to manage spreadsheet risk under Sarbanes-Oxley. So first of all, there is the need for end-to-end visibility. The environment I showed you earlier showed that very well, and it was very often these have been designed from the ground up to offer end-to-end visibility. But that's very difficult if you've got spreadsheets in an environment that you don't know who owns them, you don't know how they're used, you don't know necessarily where they are in the environment. It creates a whole set of problems from a Sarbanes-Oxley perspective. At the same time, changes made to these spreadsheets, they need to be very carefully controlled as well. You need to have 100% audit trail within Sarbanes-Oxley. And if you have all these spreadsheets, a part of that environment, spreadsheets don't come with controls. That's why they're powerful and they're flexible. But from a Sarbanes-Oxley perspective, you need to have them in place somehow, and there are multiple ways of doing that, and we'll show you one shortly. The other issue is that senior management, typically the CEO and the CFO, need to be able to verify every quarter, and obviously with the annual results as well, that the results they are submitting are an accurate reflection of the business. And if you've got spreadsheets outside the standard corporate IT SOX environments, that's very difficult to achieve. It's actually almost impossible unless you're bringing a degree of control to your spreadsheet environment that parallels and reflects the controls you need, or you already have rather, in a corporate IT environment. So moving on. Key issue again within Sarbanes-Oxley, segregation of duties, 4 eyes. You can't check your own work. You have to be able to do that. And again, that's very difficult within a spreadsheet because it is an uncontrolled tool, albeit a very powerful one. You also need access control. All of this backs up the issues around segregation of duties, around audits, around verification. And then moving on to the next point. The whole thing needs to be done proactively. You can't be running around at the end of every quarter trying to bring all these controls in place. They must be in there from minute one. And lastly, from the good of the business, it needs to be cost effective. As we touched on earlier, Productivity have found that the workload around Sarbanes-Oxley compliance has increased 10% in the last 2 years. That's obviously mean that you've got to bring in more staff, apply more budget, and that's for a set of regulations that's been in place for 15 years. That's not a great place to be, but at the same time, people have to comply. So moving on. The issue with Sarbanes-Oxley clearly is that there remains scope for fines, there are reputational issues. The use of spreadsheets, uncontrolled spreadsheets in a Sarbanes-Oxley environment could mean that companies have to restate earnings with all the implications that involves. And lastly, there can be the threat of legal action as well. So there are significant challenges. So spreadsheets are an inevitable element of the Sarbanes-Oxley environment. They're hugely powerful, very flexible, but they need to be controlled. I'll now hand over to Jeremy, who will show you one way of doing that.
Good. Well, thank you very much, Graham. Welcome, everybody. This is Jeremy Conde, VP of Americas. Thanks for Graham for sort of explaining the backdrop to this very important challenge that is facing many finance departments. So what I'm going to do now is just sort of, using more of an illustrative approach, sort of take you through a sort of a typical environment that we see in many of our clients, and also touch on where perhaps Cluster 7's tool set can add value and help assist in specific areas. So, firstly, of course, in any major corporation, there are multiple departments. And obviously, this requires, effective communication between each. And as I'm sure we all know who've worked for large firms, it's often difficult enough to actually get effective communication in your department, let alone across departments. So, in this scenario, here we have the sales team, the finance team, the reporting team, three very important elements of a quarterly SOX financial reporting process, of course. And as we explained, littered across these different departments are spreadsheets doing a multitude of different jobs, some of them more important than others. And many organizations, to all intents and purposes, don't really have a holistic understanding of where these files are and who's actually using them. Each individual undoubtedly understands the files that they use. Their manager may have a somewhat understanding of their department, but it's very rare that departments and managers really do truly understand where all these files are. And then to compound it, of course, these things aren't standalone. They're often interconnected. So there's links between files, there's data that are data connections. So information is basically moving, often invisibly in many cases, between files that, again, the organization doesn't really know where they exist, doesn't really know how the users are actually updating these files. So again, it's not particularly difficult to sort of foresee that mistakes, misunderstandings are very easy to squeeze into this process. Yeah. So if we move forward in terms of how Cluster 7 can help, the first is that there's two technologies that we have, or there's two approaches, I should say, to sort of help identify files and all these links. One is a quantitative approach. The other is a qualitative approach. Different organizations choose one usually before the other, based more on a cultural phenomena from what we've seen. But clearly, if you're in IT, there's people tend to gravitate towards the technical tools. And these allow you to basically scan the network, looking for files that exist in certain departments, that have been modified in a certain time frame. So, for example, show me all the spreadsheets that were edited in the last 3 months. That gives you a good indication of files that are actually actively being used. And the qualitative side is more of a questionnaire. And that's extremely important because no matter how robust the scanning technology is, you really do need to ask the user, what does this file do? Where does it get its data from? What's its purpose? Where does it send its data to? So on and so on. So when it comes to this whole inventory and identification aspect of SOX and understanding the EUCs that drive it, Cluster 7 has that full service capability. And then as part of that analysis, not only do you identify the files, where they are, who's using them, but you can now also start to understand the criticality of files. So it's true to say that, in most organizations, there are hundreds, if not thousands, if not tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of spreadsheets. But actually, in most organizations, there are usually hundreds that actually really matter. And by that, they're particularly important in producing that final mile report. They may be particularly complex in terms of the number of macros and formulas they have. There's a variety of criteria that can be used to help understand the criticality. But again, as this illustration depicts, they're scattered across different departments. Some are linking, some are not. And again, without that holistic understanding, it can be very difficult for any individual or organization to truly understand. And of course, this means when the final SOX reports come out, if it truly is built on a situation that we're depicting here, it's not beyond the wit of man to think that actually it's quite easy for a mistake to slip in or for something to be changed inadvertently without anybody realizing the consequences. And this is obviously, to Graham's point, why you see misstatements, why you see potential fines. There was only one recently in the UK concerning private client information not being expunged. So this can have quite some serious consequences. Moving on. Now, once you've actually identified the really important files, it's best practice now to actually start to monitor those to make sure that they operate in a fashion that you understand. So typically with these key files, you're expecting the users, and there's often a team of users interacting with these critical files in any given time period. But you want to make sure that if a file is meant to have only its data updated, that's business as usual. You want to make sure, obviously, that that actually happens and that people don't go in and start changing formulas. They don't go and start changing macros. Is the information, you've got a link perhaps to a database, the general ledger. Is that information being nourished? Is that link operating correctly? So on and so on. So this is where the Cluster 7's Enterprise Spreadsheet Manager gives you that full transparency. So here we have the full audit trail, all the changes in all of these critical workbooks, as well as the ability then to monitor that audit trail and detect unusual behavior. Information's missing, information stale, something was changed that was unexpected, something wasn't changed that should have been. Whatever it is, this is able to be provided. So you get that full audit trail. And of course, the complement to that is you have versions, and best practice dictates that you really want to be now keeping each version of each critical workbook. You have the full audit trail for each version, but again, if you're ever challenged by the auditors or regulators to basically go back in time and reproduce certain results, this now allows you to do that. You can go back to that version of the spreadsheet that was used 2 quarters ago, whatever, pull it down, understand it, look at the audit trail. You've now got full transparency in terms of who changed what, when, and where, allowing you to answer that question. So this is really best practice. Many of Cluster 7's clients, in fact, the vast majority of Cluster 7's clients are using us in the financial reporting SOX process. If they're going to use us anywhere, this is typically where they will use us. This is the type of capability that we bring, and this is the kind of value add that we can bring and reassurance to an otherwise rather opaque process. Excellent. At this stage, I'm going to hand back to Graham.
Yes, if you would, thank you. So, to summarize, I think everyone recognizes that spreadsheets are some of your most valuable assets. We're not encouraging people to move away from them, but at the same time, we need to recognize that the Sarbanes-Oxley workload is increasing. As I said, 10% in the last 2 years. So using a kind of find, assess, manage model that Jeremy has just outlined can help you bring the same level of the SOX controls in your spreadsheet environment as you have with your IT environment, which should, if it's implemented correctly, help you address issues that prevent you from having to restate your earnings, suffer reputational damage, or suffer fines and so forth. So with that, we move on to questions. Now we've got a few questions in, so thanks so much for posting those. A few of them are quite technical, so if it's okay with yourselves, we'll come back to you separately. But Jeremy, there are a couple of questions. I'm trying to sort of bring several sort of points together. I think this can be, as with any technology, regardless of what it's designed to do, there's an approach to kind of selling it to the business. In your experience, what kind of approaches do you sell this idea sort of more widely in the business in order to perhaps move it forward in terms of a project?
Yeah, good question. Thanks, Graham. So, yes, I mean, again, there's a couple of ways that organizations tend to view the situation that I just conveyed. Obviously, there's an appreciation that this could happen. So really putting in controls does make sense, but there's definitely an anxiety from the business that this type of software potentially is going to slow the user down. It's going to interfere with their workflow. It's going to be more work. So one thing that Cluster 7 has spent a tremendous amount of time and energy around is actually making this extremely user-friendly. It's a very, very low impact. There's nothing to log into. There's really no software to learn per se. There's the way the software works, it only, if it fires an alert, it only does it for exceptional activities. You're not getting peppered with noise. So we certainly understand there's a compliance and a risk management function here, of course, but we equally appreciate the fact that it's really got to be very user-friendly. And this is why we often find the SOX department typically will often be the very, very first place that will engage with Cluster 7. But over a relatively short period, that will expand into the operational areas, the asset management areas. Certainly with banks, you've got things like stress testing and model governance. So many of our organizations, many of our clients have been with us for in excess of a decade. We're now a 15-year-old firm, and a lot of them have started in one area, typically finance, as I say, and then over successive years have basically expanded their license. And a number of them now have really true enterprise-wide licenses affecting all business areas from one end of the company to the other. So again, that's something we definitely take care and attention around. It's very, very important that the business thinks this as an assist and not a stick. So yeah, good question.
Okay, I think actually I've got one more question. I think you might have answered it already, but which parts of the business sort of typically benefit the most from using this type of solution, would you say?
Yeah, good. Yeah, very good question. And actually, this is actually a very, very interesting question that often does get posed, because many organizations will genuinely have tens of thousands of spreadsheets. In fact, one of our banking clients did some analysis, and they found that they had 300 million spreadsheets scattered across the organization. And, sometimes that can prove to be absolutely alarming, of course. How on earth do you even think about tackling something so huge? But actually, working with Cluster 7, and from our experience working with similar organizations, we were able to sort of highlight where we think of what we would think of as hotspots. First one, as we said, is going to be Sarbanes-Oxley. Typically, financial reporting, the controller area is going to be a user of key spreadsheets. I mentioned model governance. That's another. Stress testing, obviously, a very big issue with banks at the moment. Then you start getting into things like trading and product control. Again, that's very important. So there are certain, and again, from our experience, now obviously I'm talking a lot about financial firms. If you're an asset manager, if you're an insurance firm, again, there are different areas. Actuarial department, for example, in insurance is another very large user of very, very complex spreadsheets. So whether you're a corporate or a medical firm or a finance firm, we've got a lot of experience, and we can often sit down with you as a client and give you some guidance as to where we would suggest you start turning over those stones to find those key files. But again, our tool set is very robust and is designed to basically enable you using both quantitative and qualitative processes to tease out and find those spreadsheets irrespective of the department.
That's perfect. Okay, Jeremy, thank you for that. If you want to move on to the next slide. So, I'd like to say thank you to everyone for attending today. Appreciate you sparing the time to visit us today. If you have any more questions, Jeremy's email is on the screen, jcondi@cluster7.com. He'll be more than happy to answer your questions. And if you need more information, moving on to the next slide, clearly there is a whole plethora of information at cluster7.com. So with that, we'll say thank you very much for coming along today. The recording will be available on the Cluster7 website, and we'll be emailing it to everyone who registered for this webinar. But with that, we'll say thank you very much, and do enjoy the rest of your day.